Brexit Secretary is in effectively open rebellion against the Prime Minister. There was talk yesterday of him resigning over the issue of a customs backstop. And this is all about avoiding a hard Irish border. That's beyond the end of the transition period in 2021. Now, the Prime Minister says they're going to go to the EU negotiations in the coming days and weeks, and they're going to say, look, we'll have a backstop that's going to make sure there's no hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, as she has promised, one of her red lines. But that'll just be for a short period of time. However, she hasn't put an actual date on when it should end. Now, a backstop that is time limited, which isn't limited by any time, is not time limited. Hence the Brexit Secretary's worry that we will effectively be tied to the European Union, customs union, unable to make trade deals, we're able to help make the rules, just be a rule taker, not a rule maker, indefinitely after Brexit means it won't be Brexit. But what is going to happen? Should he go? Will he go? And the ongoing shenanigans, of course, with Labour's Brexit fudge. Well, let's talk to two guests on this. So Bill Cash is a Conservative MP for Stone, a friend of the show, a well-known Eurosceptic, and Labour MP for Poplar and Limehouse, Jim Fitzpatrick, a Remain campaigner, also a good friend of the show. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Morning, Julia.
Morning. So Bill Cash, let's start with you. Do you think that we may get to the point where the likes of David Davis, maybe even Boris Johnson, Liam Foxwell, need to actually resign from the cabinet if we're not going to be delivered the Brexit that voters were promised?
Well, I think there's some speculation and talk this morning, I gather, but I haven't had a chance to read the newspapers. What I can say is that I had Karen Bradley, the Northern Ireland Secretary, in front of my European Scrutiny Committee for well over an hour the other day, and we discussed the Northern Ireland border issue in great detail, as you can imagine. And the bottom line is that there is an enormous amount of disinformation being put around by the European Commission, by Barnier, by Tusk and co., all about the Irish question, because they're trying to use the Irish issue as leverage for getting the kind of arrangements in Ireland as a whole which they would like. Because basically what they really want is to try to push the United Kingdom, I would say issuing ultimatums, for the purpose of trying to get the United Kingdom to stay in the single market as far as Northern Ireland is concerned, which is completely unacceptable for the very simple reason that we know, and everybody else knows, that Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and we are not going to be in the single market or the customs union, and the Labour Party have effectively agreed that themselves, and that's part of this discussion, this dissension that's taken place yesterday with Keir Starmer and co. They know perfectly well you can't leave the European Union in line with what the British people have voted for and stay in the customs union, the single market. And yet Barnier and co. are saying Irish first, and actually they are putting themselves into an extremely, I think, unacceptable and completely absurd position of trying to use leverage to force the British, which they won't succeed in doing, into breaking up the United Kingdom.
Well, let's put this Jim Fitzpatrick, and we certainly will move on to Labour's latest fudge, because there's quite a lot of concern of some of the backbenchers there. Well, if you could explain the policy to me, Jim, I'd love to know. But first of all, let's focus on the cabinet rather than the shadow cabinet. I mean, do you think this is basically, some people are claiming that the EU are basically using Ireland as a way to stop Brexit, to thwart the democratic will of the British people, given that that's pretty much what they've done every time any country has voted against anything the EU wants to do?
Well, it's quite clear that we're in a negotiation, and we are one country.
We're in a capitulation, not a negotiation.
It's a negotiation between us and the Commission, representing 27 member states, all of whom have got a different agenda in terms of what relationship they want to see with us. The Irish border question is clearly one that they can use as leverage, and in that instance, why wouldn't they? Our position isn't clear. The government promised a white paper, which hasn't materialised. Jeremy's joke yesterday, comparing the government's position with the policies of Northern Rail, with cancellations and delays all over the place was quite a good joke and got quite a laugh in the Commons. But the government is yet still today discussing what its position is going to be. We're supposed to be debating 15 Lord's amendments next week. Earlier this week, we were told it was going to be a 12-hour session on Tuesday. Now we're told it might be split over 2 days. We won't know how we're going to be debating these issues next week until the Leader of the House makes a business statement later on this morning.
I mean, it is an absolutely extraordinary situation. It's an absolute shambles, no question at all about that. So, Bill Cash, come back to you. Look, is it now time for the likes of the European Research Group, the led by Jacob Rees-Mogg and others, to perhaps say to Theresa May, it's time to go a leadership challenge and get someone in who might actually have a bit of backbone when it comes to these negotiations? Because as I said to Jim Fitzpatrick, it doesn't feel to me, and I've spoken to numerous people who voted Remain as well as Leave voters, people who voted Remain who want people, the government, just to get on with it and deliver that democratic mandate. That this is literally becoming a national humiliation and capitulation and not a negotiation.
Well, look, I'm pretty closely associated with, in fact, I'm one of the inner core of the European Research Group, so I'm not going to mince my words. I actually believe strongly that we have got to go through these negotiations. The government's position at the moment is not something which can be subsumed, as some of the dissidents are suggesting, by handing over the negotiations to be decided by Parliament. That is complete nonsense. And there is an amendment which is coming down the road, which Jim referred to just now. One of these amendments would actually absurdly suggest that the government should be told effectively not effectively, but actually told by a resolution of the House of Commons that the negotiating position will be decided by Parliament. Actually, that is complete rubbish, because the British people gave an instruction to Parliament by Act of Parliament, which itself gave the referendum to the British people to decide that the decision would be taken by the people, not by Parliament itself. And when you say that you're going to abdicate your responsibility as members of Parliament and give it to the people, you have to do so. Now that brings us to the very simple question about leaving the European Union. That was decided by that Act of Parliament. We agreed to Article 50 by a massive majority of 499, and the actual third reading of the repeal bill, before it went to the Lords, which you referred to, was decided by every single Conservative MP. It cannot be decided by anybody other than the government. The government's in a negotiation, and the reality is the idea that Theresa May would be forced into a leadership election, to answer your precise question, at this time really is just simply unacceptable and absurd. She has got to carry through these negotiations. They are complicated, and they're largely complicated because the EU simply will not recognise that we have lawfully, under Article 50, with a referendum, with Acts of Parliament, agreed that we will leave the European Union. And they can't actually bring themselves to understand that that means that we are equal partners or equal negotiators in relation to these.
Well, yeah, but we'd have to act like it for them to be treating us like that. So, Bill Cash, thank you. Jim Fitzpatrick, final word to you. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn scored some points, as you mentioned earlier in PMQs yesterday, when it comes to Brexit. He said this government has delivered more delays and more cancellations than Northern Rail. As you say, it got a big laugh. But the reality is, although, as he's quite right to say that Theresa May's handling of Brexit has been a shambles, there's no doubt at all also that his handling of Brexit has been a complete fudge, hasn't it?
Well, yeah, but he can afford to do that. He's the opposition. He doesn't have to outline
So
policy.
appreciate your honesty there.
Well, it's the government's job, and of course, until the government actually states its position, on the Labour benches, there are people who clearly want to leave straight away. There are people who want to try to get the softest Brexit possible, and there are some people who would want to frustrate the referendum and stay within the European Union. So Jeremy's got a problem in terms of uniting the Labour benches, but of course our job is to challenge government, to oppose government, and until we see what they're actually putting forward, it's very difficult to see how united the Labour benches will be, and we won't know what that will be until later on this morning and after the cabinet meeting.
An awful lot of the detail in these Brexit battles will pass most, I like to say, sensible people who've got lives by. But can you just explain what, in layman's terms if you can, what this battle is between David Davis and Theresa May, and how serious and how integral a part of the Brexit deal it is?
Well, I think it's quite an important part. I mean, the battle is because, as you know, all sides, including Brussels, Dublin and London, have promised to have no border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And Theresa May and the British government are trying to develop alternative arrangements for customs that would avoid any checks at that border. Brussels is very sceptical that those arrangements could ever work. And that's why they've been working on what's called a backstop in case they don't work. And the backstop that Theresa May has been developing is to stay in the European Union's customs union for what looks like an indefinite period. What David Davis says is he's happy to have the backstop on the basis that he hopes never to have to use it, but he's certainly not happy to have it indefinitely, because he thinks that if it's down as something that could be indefinite, Brussels will keep us in the customs union forever.
I mean, he is right on this. This would be tying the Brexit Secretary's hands when he's dealing with Michel Barnier, the EU negotiator, because what on earth would be the incentive for Michel Barnier to offer anything, right, in terms of any other concessions? Not that I think we've seen a single concession so far from the EU. If he knows that if he doesn't offer anything, then we'll basically stay and carry on paying in, no problems for the EU whatsoever. I mean, there is the minor issue of a democratic vote in the UK being thwarted, but why would that worry Michel Barnier?
Well, the problem is that, you have to find some way of avoiding having any controls at all on that border, because that's what both sides have said they want to do. And it's not clear at the moment that any of the other ideas being put forward by the British government would do that. And that's why there is this suggestion that staying in the customs union might be the only way forward. It is true that that's something that Brexiteers don't want, but they may have to choose between having that or having a border in Ireland.
And I think maybe there'll be an awful lot of Brexit voters who will not be that bothered about there being some sort of border in Ireland on account of how they are different countries. And if one is in the EU and one's not, it seemed to me to be quite obvious that there might have to be some sort of border, soft border, hard border. I have to say, as a Brexiteer, I'm not really bothered about that.
Well, no, but it's more difficult when you're dealing with Dublin, and it's also more difficult when you're dealing with the DUP who support Theresa May's government. Yeah,
indeed. It's a complicated one. Just finally, John Peet, you have a close watch of these affairs. Do you think that David Davis will resign? Do you think David will he'll give in to Theresa May, or do you think she'll give in to him? Where do you think this is going to end?
I think we'll end up, as we do in these things, with a fudge. There will be a proposal for a backstop involving the customs union. It'll say in principle it should be time limited, but they'll be slightly vague about what kind of time limit that means. And then there'll be further discussion in Brussels and another round of fudge. At some point that may not work, but I think it will get us through a few more weeks.
John Peet, you may well be correct there. John Peet, political and Brexit editor of The Economist. Thank you for joining us. Let's talk to Iain Duncan Smith now, as a former Conservative Party leader. Good morning to you, Iain.
Morning.
Good morning. Now, we've just been talking to John about what might well happen. I'm going to ask you what you think should happen. You're a man who, do you actually resign from the cabinet yourself? You threatened a number of times that you would resign over issues of funding for your welfare reforms when you were Work and Pensions Secretary. Do you think that the time has come for the Brexit Secretary, David Davis, your fellow Brexiteer, to basically tell Theresa May, put up or shut up, and if you don't deliver Brexit as people expected, it's time for me to go?
I have a very simple principle that if you have a man in the cabinet charged with negotiating Brexit and he requires that you have a timescale set as a limit to be able to help him negotiate properly, then you should give it to him, because otherwise what's the point of having somebody to negotiate for you if you then go on and tie his hands when he goes to the negotiating table? I'm completely in support of what David Davis is about. He has made it very, very clear indeed that not having a timetable would be a disaster. And there's a couple of points that even haven't come out. For example, once we've left then essentially to agree any change, all 27 have to have a vote, not just a majority vote. So they all have to agree, unanimity. That means, therefore, if you don't have a time limit on when to do this, then the EU can just go on and on and on with Wallonia and various others saying, "Oh, I don't like a bit of this. I don't like a bit of that. We're not."
And there's no incentive whatsoever. I mean, the EU, basically, their position is they'd like us to stay because we contribute all these tens of billions of pounds every single year to the budgets, and they'll have to either cut budgets or force other members to pay up. If not, so it's in their interest for us to keep the status quo. And we know, do we know? It's quite obvious from previous reactions of the EU to what's democratic votes of referendums in other countries, Ireland, France, Denmark, and elsewhere, is that they will have no issue whatsoever with the democratic will of the British people being thwarted. But I'd like to think that our own Prime Minister might have a problem with that.
I think the problem really is here that the civil servants have kind of got a grip of some of the negotiation. I think the real issue is, for them, they're in desperation to have a deal almost at any price. And I've written in the Times today to say that a deal at any price isn't a deal, it's a straitjacket. And we therefore should recognise the fifth largest economy in the world, the European Union's single biggest trading partner in the world. We have some clout. Plus, we have put on the table £40 billion to settle accounts of things that they say that we owe. I don't wholly agree with that, but that notwithstanding, over 40 years, we should take that off the table and simply say, if you keep messing around, we leave with no deal and we leave with our money in our pocket, and you will have to go sing for it. And I think this is a moment, and this is what I wrote today, when we have to have some serious courage to go in and say, we've had enough of this messing around. We either talk about trade, get on and do it, and stop using Ireland as some kind of stick to beat a dog, which is what's going on at the moment. The Irish issue could be settled in 2 seconds flat if the Irish government was prepared to sit down politically and sort it out. They're not. They're allowing themselves to be used by the EU to try and beat the UK dog, and this is not going to work. We have to say enough's enough. After all, 65 to 70% of Irish export trade ends up in the UK. Not having a trade arrangement with the UK would be a disaster for them, and this is where this is heading. So we need to say to them, enough's enough.
You say we need to have the courage, but does the Prime Minister have the courage? Because by all accounts, she is very much now giving in to pretty much what the Remainers, I would say Remoaners, the likes of Ollie Robbins, is her Brexit advisor, used to work for David Davis, went to work in Number 10, who basically, as far as I can tell, watching the negotiations, not from inside but from outside, that has given in on pretty much every demand of the EU, given every single concession we possibly can. At this rate, we are not going to, in any meaningful way, be leaving the EU.
Well, that's my point, really, which you have a political negotiator in the cabinet, David Davis, and I don't think that you can afford to have a second negotiator who is a civil servant. One must serve the other. And in our democracy, the civil servant must serve the minister, and it must be the negotiating minister. And I think there is a very simple statement here to be made, which is that we want David Davis to get on, do the negotiations. He has said he needs a time limit. I think he should get it.
Okay, and if he doesn't get it, and we know this document will be published later today, that's supposed to be discussed at the Brexit or the Brexit cabinet, although, of course, it may well be seen by the EU before the Brexit cabinet get to discuss it by all accounts. Should David Davis resign if the Prime Minister doesn't deliver that time limit?
Well, I can't advise him what to do, but I can say this.
Would you, in that situation, if you were in his position, would you go?
He's made it clear. Well, I've gone when I didn't agree with him anymore and I disagree with George Osborne. But my point really is that there's a moment when the job you've been given is not the job that you can do. And at some point you have to make that decision. And all I would advise him is that he may fast be approaching that point.